Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. We are back discussing Dante. We're exploring Dante's Divine Comedy for this entire year. And welcome, it's glad to see so many people here. And the format that we are going to use, this is going to be extremely interactive. Everybody who has read these chapters, the final chapters of the Inferno, is welcome to talk about their impressions, what they got from it. And I encourage you to do that. You will get more value out of these meetup if you do that. And go ahead and type exclamation mark in order to share. We're going to start with Phil. Phil has this wonderful spreadsheet and giving an overview. So we're going to start with that, but I want to encourage everybody to share what they got. At this point, only people who have read these chapters are welcome to share their impressions of it. Others can listen in. After all the presentations, we're going to go into the breakout rooms, so we'll get to discuss these in small groups, and then we'll come back and ask the big questions that we have on our minds, and we'll deal with all the questions. Okay, so that's the format. So let's get started. Phil, the floor is all yours.
Okay. Hello, everyone. So again, my aim in doing what I'm doing is to try to help those who are new to this, because if you've already read Dante many times, then you probably can orient yourself easier. But from a perspective of a person who hasn't read Dante in a while, or who is just reading it for the first time, I think it can be pretty overwhelming. The amount of detail, the amount of changing scenery is, I think, in some ways dizzying. And I actually think of a kaleidoscope, when I think of everything that we've covered so far, 34 cantos of ever-changing, very fast-paced dynamics of the story. So anyway, what I want to do though is, before we, this is the last session we're going to have on Inferno, and I want to make sure that we all can zoom out a little bit and take in the territory that we've covered, the landscape that we've covered, and it's a lot. And I think if you've stuck with it, congratulations to you. You're doing great. I know a lot of people are find it very hard to digest this amount of material in a short time. So what I want to do now is I'm going to share this Excel spreadsheet that what I've done essentially is I've broken out everything that we've covered by canto, a particular type of geography that we're encountering. And then obviously, everything is here is centered around sins and punishments, crime and punishments, if you will.
Phil, can you do one thing? Can you put the spreadsheet again in the chat for people who came in afterwards?
Absolutely. Let me try doing that. Actually, let me stop sharing.
So, folks, you will have the spreadsheet covers. It's like an overview. It's like a great overview of all of Inferno. So you can open it up on your computer if you want and follow along. What Phil will have to do is he's going to have to zoom in on parts of the spreadsheet, so you can actually read over there. So you can do a combination of both of them, whatever is convenient to you. Okay. All right, there it is. Go ahead, Phil.
Okay. Let me start this over again. Sorry, 1 second. I accidentally closed the file, so let me just open it again.
No problem.
All right, here we go. Okay. And let me share it. Okay, can you see it? Can everyone see it?
Yes, but it's on one side. Okay, now we can see the top. Very good.
Okay. All right. So again, just zooming out a little bit. I don't want to bore you with the details or overwhelm you with the details, but zooming out, we have some of the geography that I've tried to color code to make it a little bit easier to follow along. And I think last time we had some questions about the rivers of hell. So all the rivers that we've crossed are in blue. So you have the Acheron, that's the first one that we've covered.
Just a second, let me go ahead and mute. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. So Acheron, that's the first one, and Charon was our carrier across that, the ferryman.
Just a second, hold on. Okay, go ahead.
Are we good?
Yeah, that's good. Go ahead.
Okay. All right. So all the rivers are in blue. And again, the rivers, they have semantic meaning in that they actually separate logical parts of hell from each other. So in other words, the first river that we cross is the actual entrance into hell. And then we have, that's the Acheron, this one right here. I'll highlight it, I guess. And then we have the sins of incontinence. And then once we cover that, and they're highlighted as well, they're together. Then once we cover those, we get into another river, which is the river Styx. And we have Phlegius, the carrier, who, again, boats us across. So all of these guys that are ferrying us are in red, all our means of transportation, if you will. And then we get to the city of Dis, and the cities, the structures are color-coded in gray. So we have three major structures: the castle of the virtuous pagans in Limbo, then we have the walls of Dis, and then we have Malebolge, where we've been spending most of our time in those 10 ditches of Malebolge, the sins of fraud. And then down at the bottom here, we have the final river, Cocytus, and the three areas there, the Cana, or Caina, Ptolemea, and Judeca. And then there's a small area called Antinora in there. But the three sections really are there in the ninth circle. So the circles of hell are here. Then the cantos are on the left. So basically it just gives you a visual way to follow kind of the geography and everything we've covered so far. So looking at this, I just want to make one simple comment about how Dante, when he was designing this, when he was designing and as an author, as the poet, the structure of this, he made certain decisions. And obviously you can see that the majority of our time, the majority of the cantos, we almost have a 50% spent on fraud and betrayal. If you, I mean, what this allows you to do is to see that very clearly. The amount of cantos that we spent on fraud and betrayal is roughly 50% of everything else. And then all the other sins, they're kind of, we have one very short canto for the lust, for gluttony, for avarice, but then we spend the majority of our time on fraud. And that's obviously very significant. His decision to make fraud sort of the focus point of his treatment of hell. And an interesting exercise for all of us is to think why he did that. Why not spend more time on some of the other sins, violence, sins of violence, or something else? But fraud and betrayal he sees as the worst sins. And of course, it's interesting to think about it in terms of his own time, because Dante is a historical person, just like everyone else, like we all are, placed in a particular context. And it must be that for him, those sins were the most destructive in terms of society that he lived in. And anyway, I think that's something interesting to think about and ponder, this idea of fraud and its importance. So that's everything I wanted to really say about this. And you guys, again, this is more for the research and further, your own use, however you want to use it. If you find it useful, great. So that's all I'm going to say about this part. So I wanted to just very briefly touch on something we talked about last time. I think it found a bit of resonance, so that's why I want to revisit it. And that was the idea of Dante, of four different Dantes in the work. So Dante, the protagonist, Dante, the narrator, who kind of steps back and kind of knows the future, right? As opposed to the protagonist to whom everything is, comes to him as something new. And then you have Dante, the historical person who lives in Florence and experiences different things and references to that. And then you have finally Dante, the poet, the creator of the work. So building on that topic, I couldn't help but think about his decision to make his work, to embed his work in so much of historical context that's very local to him. Not, he picks all of these people that are his contemporaries that are very difficult for us to relate to in some way. But the way to relate to them, I was thinking about this, and my conclusion is that we need to use a little bit of imagination and ask ourselves, if Dante were writing this today, what would be, or who would be the people that he would populate hell with? And I couldn't help but jotting down a few names that I think would resonate. And again, he may not have foreseen the success of his own work. He might have thought, well, maybe people will remember it in the next 200 years, and that would be, the upper limit on that. He probably never foresaw that his work would be studied 700 years after his time. And had he foreseen that, maybe he wouldn't have chosen to be so specific about the people and the places that he picked. But at the same time, he gave us a metaphor for relating it to our own day. So I just thought maybe if he were writing it today, probably the people that we would see in hell, or story, at least references to, would be like somebody like Bernie Madoff. We're dealing with fraud. Somebody like Elizabeth Holmes from Theranos, Donald Trump, maybe, Hunter Biden, Jeffrey Epstein, Martin Shkreli. So just these people that are on the tip of our tongues and are very much in our consciousness today. These are the same types of notorious characters that were present and active in Florence and Pisa, in all of these different republics in Italy at the time. And so when he mentions somebody like Ugolino or Chaco or any of these people, they must have resonated. They must have been just as recognizable to his audience as Epstein or Madoff is to us today. And the cities, maybe he would have been writing about the gangs in Chicago and people in San Fran and New York and Atlanta, and just again, the places are not as familiar to us today now, but they must have been very, very familiar to the people that were reading this. And I guess that's the point of this choice that he made. It makes his work more vulnerable in a sense, but it also makes it somewhat more relatable if we use a little bit of imagination to bridge it to our own experience. So all the people that he used, they must have been very at the forefront of consciousness. So that's the point I wanted to make about that. Also, as far as Dante the poet, there's some areas that I think are interesting to compare to others, in a sense that not everything is as compelling as everything else. There are some passages that I find much more compelling than others. And seeing that and seeing Dante's own biases in describing it, I think also makes it for a very personal, intimate reading of the poem. It's not academic. Everything is very personal to him. Some of the sinners that he encounters, he gets very upfront and close with. In fact, he gets into a brawl, if you remember one of the last cantos, with Bocca, one of the sinners, one of the traitors. And the reason he does this is probably because that whatever he did, the betrayal, the treachery that Bocca carried out, was very close to Dante's experience. It must have hurt him. It must have been extremely painful for him. And so you see that bias, you see that lack of objectivity. But I think actually in some ways that actually makes it more interesting and more exciting to read, because it's not just an objective sort of disinterested person's treatment. It's a treatment from a person who is involved in the politics of Florence and the politics of Guelph versus Ghibelline. And it just makes it for a very, almost like a, I mean, not a detective story, but more of a drama, personal drama type of treatment. That's my second point. How much time we have? I think actually I will probably stop here because I have some more material to cover, but maybe we can wait till everyone else gets a chance, and then I'll have some more points maybe at the end.
Wonderful. So we'll have you come back at the end or somewhere in the middle. All right, folks. So this is highly interactive. So would like to know what you got so far. You can talk about Inferno as a whole, or just this particular section, or you can talk about your experience, reading Dante. Go ahead and type ! If you would like to share. Joe, go ahead. Just a second. I want to make sure. Give me a second. Sorry about that. Go ahead, Joe.
Am I unmuted? Yeah, there we go. Yeah, I mean, so, I kind of rushed through these cantos, so I didn't do them justice. But one of the things that I really found to be the most interesting was the treatment of Muhammad and the schisms, specifically because Dante actually experienced a schism in its own right, so that he was seemingly usually harsh to individuals that diverted from the church, even though he had his own little dust up essentially with people that were interested in expanding the Pope's power at that particular moment in time. As to your point about the idea of betrayal, or even the idea of fraud being such a critical part in his analysis, is because I feel like fraud undermines everything in society. It undermines the ability to even function as a society. So those individuals that were in positions of power that betrayed, the people, and betrayed people's trusts, and even to the point of fraud of people then that they even knew, it makes a society dysfunctional. So I think he actually, that's why he starts with I'm trying to think of off the top, like people like Ulysses, and I'm trying, and the names are escaping me at the moment anyway. Okay, I'm just doing this off the top of my head. So that's one aspect of that as well, is that the idea of fraud. But the other part of it that I really wanted to bring up is the Ugolino part of it, because it seems like Ugolino was kind of, yes, he betrayed his kin, and his speech was pretty unique, but he's pretty far down there in hell. And, it seems to me he's almost a victim to a certain degree, because he had to eat his own. There's a sense of almost pity. And I know that sounds disgusting considering everything that he did, and it went to cannibalism of his own children. But that there was something about that, the whole situation you felt badly about. So that was another aspect of it that I had taken away. Those are just my initial thoughts. I haven't written anything down in particular, but in going through it quickly, those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Joe. Next up is going to be Vanessa, Allison, and Michael. Vanessa.
Well, a couple impressions was as he was in that ninth circle, you expect it to be 1,000 degrees Kelvin or something, and yet it's as cold as anything. And part of me was thinking, well, when you get frostbite, your limbs begin to feel like on fire, the extremities. And he almost seemed to be taunting some of them, like saying, well, if you tell me this, I'll see, maybe just maybe your name will live on the earth above. And sometimes you kind of had the impression they would be forgotten, or if it was remembered, it wouldn't be in any kind way. And let's see, some of the things, like he said, oh, it's too scary to tell. Yeah, he's still told. Like I cannot just imagine. But then he did give a description. So like I said, but there was a personal thing in there. And part of it, I got the impression that uh, if you were Italian, you were given a slight forgiveness. I mean, he didn't like the French. I mean, the few times, damn the French, and I think the Greece got a bad word here and there. And even how it might describe saying, well, Greece had the only men they had were in the cradle, just kind of like the demeaning tone there. So it was kind of that impression. But then, if you're telling it from your perspective, there's national pride and everything. And luckily, I guess I remember some stuff either, I mean, it was made from Shakespeare. It's like, wait, I know that name, and as I was reading I think Canto was 32 or 33, it's like, wait a minute. It came as fresh as I was reading in high school. I'm thinking, wait, did I read this in my sleep? Because I recalled it. It was so weird. And unfortunately, I had to skim through halfway through the last one because again, so descriptive and talking about this and that. But I did think it's funny. The final doorway, so to speak, or the final level was being consumed by Lucifer. So, and I mean, that was like saying, the saliva dripping red with the color of blood. So it's like, okay, well, when your final it's your final judgment, so to speak, or the sentence is carried out, you're going to be consumed by a ball of fire. And like I said, very vivid descriptions of that, even describing the wings like a bat. I guess he didn't like bats either, but I just like, you could see, just like reading a poet talking about the imagery where the sun isn't where you expect it. So it kind of gets you thinking, well, where is he going next with this? It brings you in, even as a curious child, to see, okay, how is he going to describe this next? And you may realize even you were fooled like he does when, Virgil's saying, well, it's not what you expect. Just like as he's thinking there's someone blowing wind, you realize, no, it is the devil himself. But he's thinking there's a gust of wind where there should be none. So.
Thank you. Thank you, Vanessa. Appreciate that. Next up is going to be Allison, followed by Michael. So folks, go ahead and type exclamation mark to share what you're getting from your reading. Allison.
Hi, so this is my first time to do this. So I've been frantically reading the Inferno for about the last month. I read it in college and I realized I missed like a million things at that point. So it's really nice to read it again. I still don't understand enough Italian history to get every reference, but what some of the things that I've just loved about this, the language is just gorgeous, absolutely beautiful. And I see all these references in it, like particularly the shades. In the ballet Giselle, there's this wonderful scene where the shades try to dance someone to their death. And I realized like, oh, they got that straight from here. But the other thing is that as I read it, I was laughing so much because so many, you could just think of a million people that this book references. And I think the genius is that he wrote it 700 years ago. And yet you can sit there and pick up like easily 10 people, you're like that's so-and-so and so-and-so. And that was just wonderful to, that it's so relevant still today. So and the other thing that I really noticed about it that I certainly missed in college was the musicality of it and how it just seemed like opera to me, how there are times when just the pacing of the writing is really, really quick and then it slows down and then it speeds up to get a certain effect. And I just thought that was sheer genius. It's just, anyway, it's a real pleasure.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much, Allison, and welcome. Next up is going to be Michael, followed by Maritza. Michael.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, good. My question involves cantos 28 versus cantos 32. In cantos 28, he talks about that's Bolgia 9, and he's talking about the sowers of discord, and he ranks them from less serious to most serious as I read it. Religious schism, civil strife, and family disunion. Apparently, he finds the family disunion to be a more fundamental thing. In 32, in the ninth circle of treachery, At the lake at the bottom, you have 4 concentric circles. The outside circle, which is the least serious, is the betrayal of family. And that's just reversed from the other one, from 28. And he goes then to betrayal of community, betrayal of guests, which has that's its own in this particular, there's no corresponding thing in 28 on that. And then to betrayal of lords. And it seems like it's inverted. And I wondered about that. I mean, why would that, what's the process going on there?
Wonderful. What we'll do is that, Phil, can you keep track of this question? And then we will deal with the questions once we come back from the breakout room. So what we're doing now is we're just getting people's impressions about their experience of reading this. Then we will discuss it during the breakout rooms and people will come up with questions. If you forget, Michael, please go ahead and ask this question once we come back. Okay. Wonderful. It looks like it is etched on your mind. So that's very good. Next up is Maritza. Maritza, go ahead.
Hi. So I have to admit that I just find the Inferno to be distasteful. I'm sorry. I have not, my enjoyment of it has not increased as time has gone by. I switched to, I actually got a different translation. It's a little more poetic and melodic, and I've enjoyed the poetic nature of the story. I really do like the way it flows, and that's quite lovely. But that only works when you're listening. So I did Audible because I can listen to it a little bit softer, because when I'm reading it, I just can't get past I just reject so much of what's written here. I cannot wrap my head around, and I know I've had these conversations with CJ, or maybe this is a portent. He's not really saying that he believes that this creator is this much of an asshole. He's saying that this is his tongue-in-cheek metaphorical, dramatization of what is happening in his current life and the politics surrounding him. So I understand that from a logical perspective, but I will say that this book, more than almost anything I've read in recent time or even longer time, it just repels me. It really does. I'm still here and I'm still reading, but I am not filled with wonder. I'm only filled with wonder for the fact that it is a well-written book of horror. It really, it's lovely, the writing. I'm sorry, guys. I think it's just awful. I really, this much judgment exists in it. That's a lot of judgment and condensed into a small space. And I just have a hard time with it. I really do.
Thank you, Maritza. And folks, will have chance to discuss all of this in breakout rooms, and we can come back and ask questions. Maritza, you can ask this as a question during the Q&A. And we're really interested in, and we're going to do like a lightning round at that point. So you'll have everybody's answers to this question. So please do raise this question. It's a very important question. So it's going to be Doug, David, and Zach next. Doug. Doug, you need to unmute.
I had one question first. Maritza, what is the translation that's more poetic that you found? Or you can enter it in the chat once you find it. Because I found that too. Oddly, I went back to for different reasons. I went back to the John Ciardi translation, but because of my eyes, and the Kindle version is very easy to maneuver. And so I found that translation really easy. It's one that a lot of people look down on now because it was so popular in the 50s. But I didn't have much to say, although Phil's chart triggered something that's been sticking with me this whole time, and it finally became really obvious. But before I go into that, I mean, the last few days, maybe even the last week, I've been in kind of computer hell. And I definitely want to put most of the computer industry and the communications industry in hell. And I think Dante would approve, because most of his sins are verbal sins, communication sins, misuse of communications. And so this communication industry is anything but helping us communicate. You know, it's setting up toll booths and roadblocks and all kinds of technical conflicts and special programs to sort of make you safe and do that. And I find that actually a rather sinister force. About 20 years ago, I was in a conference around Buckminster Fuller and technology and the future of the world. And one man who was from an African American, I think he was from the South, was talking about Korea, and that the Korea this time, this was 15 years ago, I think, 10 or 15 years ago, had fiber optics and it was free to the public. Now we're still talking about fiber optics, but they're charging us like we're getting fiber optics or something. And so I find that kind of sinister use of technology and to actually pretend you're helping people communicate when you're actually blocking it. And Phil's chart really underlined this for me, because when you look at Malaboj, which I felt this as I was reading it, it's, you know, circle after circle after circle, canto after canto after canto. And looking at his chart, I could add them up, and there are 13 cantos in Malaboj, and every sin there is a sin of language, of using language to mislead, to seduce, to flatter, to steal, to do everything. Now, as a poet, the misuse of language is a major sin. And so Dante is really trying to get people to use language purely and not the way we use it now for PR and advertising. And so most of the whole PR industry that pretends to be telling the truth when actually they're lying to the people and creating division. And if you read Orwell, the hate sessions where they put up a face and everybody screams at the screen, that's what a lot of our news TV has become, whether it's right, middle, or center. It's all put a face up and scream at it. And some of those people actually deserve being screamed at. But the screaming itself doesn't actually move forward to solving a problem. It actually neutralizes people and actually leads to a misuse of people's energy. And so a third of the Inferno, 13 cantos, so that's over a third of the Inferno, is sins of language. So if you murder somebody, or if you rape somebody, or if you steal something, you don't need language to do that. It's a physical thing. You grab, you take, whether it's food or somebody's life or a sexual sin. And then it alternates. The hypocrites kind of are a verbal language. So it gets into the issue of true prophets and false prophets, who's speaking the truth and who's not. And we've been struggling with that for over 2,000 years. I mean, who's speaking the truth? And one man's false prophet is another man's true prophet. So the idea of truth and lies, I mean, it's the whole major through line. The other thing in terms of who would go into hell, I liked Phil's list. I might go much more bipartisan, but in the sense that I think there's been huge collaboration between both parties to corrupt the knowledge of how money works in our society. And it's one of the things Bucky Fuller really tried to illuminate. He wanted people to see how the money works, how big business works, where the money's going, how it's being tracked, how the laws are written to manipulate it. And so the kind of the oligarchs of the Italian early Renaissance or late medieval period that Dante's writing in, and the kind of tribes that are fighting now. So I thought if I were writing this today, or if somebody was writing this today, I would pick the fall of the Berlin Wall to be the descent into hell, And then I would write it now, and I could predict everything that's happening, which is what Dante did. You know, he's writing this in 1300, or I mean, he's pretending he's tracking an event in 1300, but he's writing it years later. So he can actually put in prophecies that he's actually lived through. So, I mean, I think there are a lot of the politicians from 1989 to today, when the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of that division between the East and the West, and the lost opportunity of cashing in the peace dividend. That's also the time around the savings and loan scandals, which were front page in all the business magazines. And then suddenly, overnight, all the business magazines were talking about race. You know, race is the big issue. And 2 or 3 years later, race was a big issue with the things that happened in LA and other places around the country. But in 1989, that was not the big issue. The big issue was the savings and loan scandal and the corruption of our financial system. But suddenly all the business magazines began to talk about race. And suddenly over about 3 or 4 years, and there were the Willie Horton ads of the Bush administration, which he later apologized to the man he ran against, Dukakis, for the kind of viciousness of those ads. It was not something Bush was proud of. But that was a time when I think that when we could have moved to a more utopian world thing, and we went more into dystopia. And a major event, I think, is getting rid of the Glass-Steagall regulation of the banks and investment banks and savings and banks in the late 90s, which Clinton did. When that happened, I actually had to pull, I was driving, I had to pull to the side of the road because I grew up with the idea that Glass-Steagall, the separation of the investment banks and savings banks so that people can gamble with your money. That was, I had to pull to the side of the road. I was hyperventilating when I realized Clinton had gotten rid of Glass-Steagall. And I've been a Democrat my whole life, but you know, that's like, oh, there's something really wrong.
So Doug, apart from placing all the people in the rungs of hell, what did you think of rest of the Inferno?
It's sort of what Maritza said, the poetry and the imagery and his, you know, you think of things like morphing from one shape from a lizard into a human. You think of that as modern movies and CGI, but, you know, Dante was writing about, you know, these minute transformations from lizards into humans and exchanging of shapes and the sort of flood of wind, cold winds and these giants, and then Satan is an even bigger giant. I mean, that suddenly we go from one size where everybody's about one size, demons and humans, to these giants, and then a super giant. There's a kind of expansion of space toward the end that was really profound for me. But the other thing is, you know, you have a freedom of looking at this and choosing your own people to go into hell. I mean, we wouldn't all agree on who should be in hell. But Dante is assuming the right to put people in hell, which I think is imaginatively really a fascinating political tool or poetic tool. Anyway, I'll end there.
Wonderful.
But the poetry, the imagery, I sped read the end because I've been so busy that the imagery of this sort of expansion and then suddenly diving into this sort of the crack that gets him out of hell, the escape. Things get very big and then there's a small way out, you know, past Satan's loins and out the other side. And the cosmology that Satan fell from the other side of Earth and into the center of Earth and I mean, it's pretty amazing where he's blending scientific theories and poetry in a really, really, really powerful mix.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Doug. Next up is going to be David, followed by Zach. David.
Wow, that's a lot to follow. So I won't answer any of those questions. But it definitely was a lot to think about. And actually, I'm starting back where even Joe brought us into the discussion, which is on how, and Philip too, on how little is spent in the discussion of violence as a sin, because it's so obvious and undifferentiable that there may not be a great deal to develop and say about it. It's so clearly something that you would feel comfortable having punished. But to take this, a little further, he's not punishing people for going to war. He's not suggesting that the warriors are the villains. It's the people who pervert the war, who lie to each other and destroy their communities. So he picks his way through the finer points of the humanity of what has to be done. Not that you can avoid war, but if you're going to do it, what are you doing to your fellow man? And so the examination of fraud, which is really every kind of lie, every kind of misrepresentation to other human beings, it's beyond the violence, because there's going to be violence in the world. Going to a screaming theater and screaming against the enemies, going to a coliseum and screaming, that is not your sin that's going to be in hell. Your sin is what you're doing to other people, right? Which you have agency over. So he's not holding us responsible at the collective level for war, but at the individual level for our kind of lying and subverting meaning, whether it's subverting the meaning of money and property that somebody has and saying, I won't respect that meaning and in your life and what that does to corrupt somebody else's life, or further, like you're saying, disrupting the meaning between people, and in that kind of horrid way, where even you've established trust, and worse, you're destroying that. So this is where I would think of perversion of language, especially, and that's why I would put the Fox News Network down in the 8th circle, and maybe have different, kinds of things for Limbaugh, Hannity, and Alex Jones, and regardless of what they're spewing, the point is it's not about engaging with truth. It's about, and I don't even mind that they're yelling at each other. Point Counterpoint was a show where people yelled at each other, but it's a matter of, at first, as Doug mentioned, it was a matter of distracting people from the real current problems in society, which is an evil. I'm going to steal your money, but I don't want you to be here. Pay attention to the race problem. It's a terrible lie, because there is a race problem. So it's gutting you with the truth in a way that's a lie. It's terrible. And then the last thing is that, finally it gets to the point where instead of just distracting you with political shenanigans, it's subverting what it means to tell the truth anyway. You can't listen, and there's not even a shred of truth in what's being said, except the most superficial level. So now it's an attack on meaning, the meaning of words, the meaning of the language, the meaning. It makes you stop breathing, right? So this, I'd like to see him depict the punishments for that, where there's no air left. Some new punishments for everything losing its color and completely, like ice is a good maybe thing. So I think there are levels, and so Maritza, you can see, I see a realm of punishment that's appropriate here. So I hope we get to talk.
Wonderful. Thank you, David. So it's going to be Zach, and then perhaps Maxine and Shirley, and then Madeline. Let's go with Zach. Zach, go ahead.
Yeah, well, first I want to thank Philip for that Excel spreadsheet. That's really awesome. I've been trying to make something similar to that on my own, but it's not nearly that in depth. So I'm definitely going to use that. Yeah, so I guess I wanted to. One of the things I've been really getting from it is the punishments, because the way I see a lot of the punishments, they are, I think, not only a way of punishing them for something they've done in the afterlife, but they're actually representing what happens to a person when they do that in this life. So like the Sullen, I really enjoyed. The Sullen, they were basically like boiling underneath the surface of a water. And, if I think that's something we can all kind of relate to. Like that is actually a state of being. That is an emotional state that a lot of people can relate to. And that is a kind of hell in that, like, if you are, just fuming at somebody, but maybe not saying anything. You are that person in that state in this life who is, in a sense, boiling underneath the water. So I thought that was really profound. The other one I really liked was the hypocrisy, and how they had the this cloak that was really elaborate on the outside, but on the inside it was lead, and it was really heavy. So there's that as well, that when somebody is not being themselves and they're being this false self, they might look great to the outside, but on the inside, they are feeling this kind of heaviness, this weight of trying to be somebody that they're not. So that in itself is very much, and again, a kind of emotional state of mind that is hellish in a sense. So I've really gotten a lot from that. The other thing I was going to say is, I wonder, this is maybe more of a question, I wonder how much Dante is kind of casting judgment onto others, and how much he is kind of like looking at himself. I guess I say that because I don't see him as being somebody like a Jonathan Edwards, who is basically saying like, I'm fine, there's nothing wrong with me, all of you people are going to hell, all of you people are going to burn. Because I don't know, Dante is the one who is traveling through hell and maybe seeing parts of himself, or maybe seeing where he might end up if he continues on the path that he is on. So I guess maybe my question would be, are we to take it as Dante is this kind of like holier than thou figure who is just like casting all of his buddies that scorned him into this hell? Or is it more of him saying like, these aspects are all a part of myself that I'm as the individual taking a cold hard look at? Yeah, so those are kind of my thoughts / questions.
Wonderful. Thanks, Zach. Zach, if we'll please ask this question again when we do Q&A. It will be really interesting to see what different people's answers is.
Okay, right on.
Thanks. Maxine, would you like to share what you got?
Well, I'm with Maritza. I am reading this, but I'm not loving it. It makes me nauseous. In fact, it is so depressing. He is so self-indulgent, and he is so sick. I mean, the things that he does, I can't even, he's beyond help. And I don't like it. And Joe pushed me into this today. Every day he says, oh, I have to read Dante. And he says, won't you read it with me? And I say, all right, I'll do it today, but no more, because I find it nauseating. The beginning was okay, but now we're to the nauseating part. His religious views and his relationship with his family and the relationship with the girl, that was really sick. He's a very sick man, and I don't like to indulge myself with sickness. I like to well, maybe it'll get better as we go on, but oh boy, I'm not liking this batch that we're reading right now.
Thank you, Maxine. And
Yeah.
I see that Joe is your guide into this space, just like Virgil was Dante's guide.
That's right. That's right.
Next up is going to be Shirley, Madeline, and Christiane. Shirley, go ahead.
Okay, I can only offer you joy, because I see no different in Dante's Inferno as of today's society. Absolutely no difference at all. And I love things that stretch my imagination, and Dante has certainly done that. The other thing, I just want to say something of joy. I was delighted in, of course, it has nothing to do with anything, but I was delighted to find his reference to Gianna Cicci and the opera that Puccini wrote, Puccini wrote that opera. And that was the only comic opera that Puccini wrote, was a one-act play. And I was surprised that he was put in hell, but he was. So I just wanted to bring that because that's a magnificent opera.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. You're welcome.
Thanks, Shirley. Next up is going to be Madeline, followed by Christiane. Madeline.
Yes. Well, thank you, everyone. I am having a blast with this. I have been we got further and further into the Inferno, I've been reading it as this sort of terrific revenge fantasy. And I truly appreciate the depth of his outrage. But I am really looking forward to getting to Purgatorio and then into Paradise and seeing what he does with his language with those. There was one portion that reminded me of social media. It was the passage in Canto 30, line starting around 145. If it happen again that fortune find you where people are in such a squabble, for to wish to hear that is a base desire. And it reminded me of following social media and also of people watching reality TV, like the Real Housewives shows. And it was just above that in that same canto where he talks, actually a lot of them, basically referring to what Zach was saying. I did notice that Dante participates in all the sins that he talks about as he goes along. He betrays the traitors. First, they betray each other by naming names of each other's names. Then he says, I'm going to tell everyone about you when I get up to the surface. So I think that part of it is an exercise in what it's like to contain some part of all those sins inside of ourselves. In other words, he's not entirely pure and distant as he goes through. He does engage and he does do each thing. So anyway, this is great. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Madeline. Next up is Christiane. Christiane, go ahead.
Hi. So I think I've said this before that I struggled reading this because I don't know much about the backstory, but around Italy and the history and the politics and all that. But I am so glad that I still attended anyway. One thing that helped me a lot, and I enjoyed this part the most, even though I did question it, was the Greek mythological figures being added to the story, and also the biblical aspect as well, because I'm very familiar with that. And I kind of, after reading this, I kind of want to study it again. So that's a new thing that I'll do. But yeah, this was a really interesting read. There were parts that were not fun to read, like the descriptions of the punishments and things like that. But I'm still glad that I got a chance to read it. I'll probably reread it again. But this time I want to learn more about Italian politics and the figures that he had in the story. I don't really know much about that. So that'll be my next goal for my next reading of the book. But thank you.
Thanks, Christiane. Now we're going to go with Phil, and then we're going to do the breakout rooms. In the breakout rooms, make sure that you let everybody speak for about 1 to 2 minutes so that you get all the thoughts on the table and then have a discussion. You come back with all the questions you have. I think Zach and Michael have already some questions, but please come back. I think Marisa has a very big question as well. So we're going to do those 3 questions, but bring all the questions back, and then we're going to go and do a lightning round of questions. So it's on to Phil. Phil, go ahead.
Hey, so I just want to do a couple of unrelated observations. This is, as opposed to sort of my initial zoom out view, this is actually zooming in at different things and maybe providing a particular insight that might help in the overall appreciation of this, because I see it's very interesting to me to observe that some people are enjoying this tremendously. Other people are turned off tremendously. Either way, we get a very strong effect from reading, which is good, I think, regardless of which way it pulls you. So I want to note a couple of things. One is a change in style and almost genre as we progress through Inferno. So we kind of didn't really spend a lot of time on these passages last time, but I thought they were fascinating. You know, the parts where we had the 10 devils fishing for sinners who are submerged in pitch. And I mean, it was such a tremendous change of scenery and tempo, if you will. And I think a lot of you who are either musically or theater oriented probably appreciated this or thought it, I'm sure noted it, how we went from sort of this methodical, very evenly paced traversal to now Dante and Virgil are being hunted by these demons who are flying around with forks and scalpels and all kinds of accessories to skewer them. And the comedic nature of this was just amazing to me. And so anyway, I just want to underline that section of it to say, what an interesting way to go from a morose mood to something a little more lighthearted, to kind of give a reader a little breathing room, if you will, and kind of reset your emotional meter to something different. So I just want to point that out. This is in, if you want to go back there, this is in Cantos 21 and 22. And we're dealing with barators who are essentially, it's fraud at a business level, which is, I mean, should be very close to home to all of us. So again, think of what your favorite fraudster in that area, and imagine him being skewered there. But then so this is comedy, and also the language there. I mean, I almost shy away from saying this, but Dante didn't, so I'm going to say it. One of the devils actually farts and uses that as a signal to the other devils to form a line and follow them along. I mean, when I read it the first time, I was almost, I was shocked. And Dante pretends like he's shocked, but he really isn't, because of course he planned all of this. He says, I've never heard such a strange noise to use as an army call, as a bugle call, which is, again, the comedic nature of this is excellent. I mean, it's just terrific. So, but the language is very vulgar, and it's on purpose. It's decisively so, because it's a comedy, and comedy in their understanding in the medieval mind was a very common low style, low brow type of work. And so Dante goes to the very bottom of this low style to make his this effect. Then we switch gears. In just a few cantos after this, we are with Ulysses. And Ulysses is anything but comedic. I mean, this is epic style story of him and his fellow, I guess, his friends going to try to get to the end of the world. I mean, this is an amazing passage that has a completely different feel to it. It's not a comedy. It's really more like an epic. And again, I don't know if you guys thought it was an enjoyable, memorable part of Inferno, but to me, it's definitely one of the, the top-notch literary passages of all time, maybe. Reading about Ulysses and his men and their resolve to go to as far as they can get to the end, and then dying in that attempt. I mean, and I don't know if you caught this, where they got to was Purgatory, was Mount Purgatory. In other words, they sailed past the Strait of Gibraltar. In Dante's mind, that would lead them to the other side of the world, the southern hemisphere. And so they got as far as humanly possible, and then God's judgment came just when they saw Mount Purgatory and saw their whatever they were trying to attain. So this whole story, even though it takes only a few verses, is executed with such mastery, just such an amazing story. And that is a completely different genre, completely different style. It's epic style. And then the third style, well, once we go past that into betrayal and fraud and personal betrayal and personal treachery, traitors, and the devastating effects that they have on their communities. We're really in tragedy. This is tragic style. This is the like Greek tragedies. You have and if you follow any of the historical context there, what happens in a lot of these situations is completely heart-wrenching. It's families being broken apart. It's cities being torn apart. It is treachery on the battlefield that results in deaths of hundreds of people, which kind of makes us now understand why it's worse than a single murder or a single act of robbery, because of how many people are affected by it. But anyway, the point being, though, is it's a change of genre again. It's a change of style and treatment. And again, this creates this beautiful, to me, it creates this beautiful kaleidoscope of different colored, like a colored glass through which you can see different sort of meaning stream to us. And I just want to point that out. In case you're reading it too fast to really appreciate it, I want to make sure that we at least have some of these bright spots to go back to. The other passage that I want to highlight is the passage about I forget the guy's name, but basically the idea is that he makes a deal with Pope that he will be absolved, and then after death, he gets Saint Francis comes to him to take him to paradise, but then a devil comes in and says, no, you can't go. He says to Saint Francis, you can't take him to heaven. If this is not a scary story, especially at the time, or a very potent story, I don't know what is. It's beautiful. There's a deal, then it goes terribly wrong. I mean, it's like a very beautiful setup for like a play. You make this deal, you're fully certain that it's going to come to fruition. You go to the afterlife, and then there's this reversal, right? What's the word for reversal I'm looking for? Anyway, it escapes me, but anyway, there's a reversal. And then finally, another very memorable passage and a thought is this idea that your soul can be in hell already while your body is still in the world. And I thought this maybe is a metaphor for the entire work, because as someone mentioned already, the idea here is not that this is about afterlife punishments. The idea is that you lead a particular kind of life and you get the punishment here and now. And in that particular case, this is executed specifically in that regard, where you have a person who is so far gone, his soul is essentially in hell already. And it just comes to, I think the way they said it, it was something like, it comes to winter, the soul comes to winter in hell, and then goes back to the body, for another period of time. But anyway, I thought, that idea, that concept is possibly a key to understanding the entire Inferno in its entirety.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Phil, to add the color to the presentation. Wonderful. All right, folks. So I'm starting the breakout rooms now. The breakout rooms will last for 20 minutes. Come back with questions, and we're going to do a lightning round. Starting the breakout rooms now. Welcome back, folks. Welcome back. All right, it's time for questions. So there are 3 people who have raised questions already, but go ahead and type exclamation mark if you would like to ask questions, and then we'll go ahead and we'll collect all the questions, and then we're going to go through all the questions together. So Zach, so let's start with Zach, Maritza, and Michael with questions. Zach, can you repeat your question?
Yeah, sure. My question was, how much should we be reading this as a self-examination on the part of Dante versus how much should we be reading it as Dante kind of condemning other people?
Very good. Very good.
Yeah.
Self-examination or condemnation. Very good. Next up was Michael. Michael, your question was about which two cantos? You're on mute.
I'm muted there. We kind of got into that in the.
You already got it? You got the answer?
Well, no, I didn't get an answer. I didn't get a satisfactory answer. But you know, we raised the question. The question is in Canto 32 and Canto 28, there are sins that bear a family resemblance to each other, the serious of which, as I read it, are inverted. So that in Canto 28, when he's talking about sowers of discord, if you're taking the seriousness to correspond to the level of hell that they're working through, they first come to religious schism, then they go to civil strife, and then they end up at the bottom there with family disunion.
Got it.
In the Canto 32, the order is reversed.
Okay.
They start out with betrayal of family. They go to the betrayal of the community and guests as a third one there, and then finally betrayal of lords.
Got it.
My question was, you know,
why?
What's going on there?
Got it. Okay. Perfect.
Yeah.
Excellent. Next up, Maritza, I'm going to keep your questions for a little bit later. First, let's put Madeline's, Vanessa's, Joe's, and then Maritza's. Madeline.
Yes, my question is about the story of Ugolino. I too was very troubled by it because I seem to remember a myth or a legend about a situation in which the father and the children are starving, and the father has the children eat his body in order to stay alive. And I've been torturing myself trying to remember what that is, because that's what a parent would do ultimately. And in fact, what Ugolino is doing is the exact opposite. Rather than like a God feeding his children through the Holy Communion ceremony of Christianity, he's the exact opposite of that. So if anyone knows the origin of the reverse of it, I'd love to hear it.
Got it. Ugolino story. Okay. Thank you. Next up is Vanessa and Joe and Maritza. Vanessa, what's your question?
Okay, my question is there any significance to why at times Virgil let Dante linger to either allay his fears or feed his curiosity, and other times he certainly ordered Dante to possibly avert his eyes and hurry out to the next area? Is this like simply a test by Virgil to see if Dante is obedient to a higher, more pure authority, or is he like viewing Dante as a child, you know, treating him more like a child and, you know, on my command and this is bad and I'll reward you such and such.
Thank you. Thank you. In terms of in what way is Virgil guiding Dante? When does he let him linger and hurry up, whether he's treating as a child or an adult? Very good.
Yeah,
next up is going to be, thank you. Next up is going to be Joe, followed by Maritza. Joe.
Yeah, why does Dante feel the need to be so violent in his depictions of how he tortures people? I mean, I think that has kind of come up anyway, but.
Very good. Why are they?
And is he really being that violent even compared to today's standards?
Thank you. Maritza, how would you phrase your question?
Well, funny enough, I think it's a little different from how I would have phrased it at the beginning of this meetup. I think the ultimate question I'm looking to ask is, do we perceive this tale as one shining a view of a super judgmental creator, or are we required to find more allegory in that image?
Okay, very good. So I'm going to a super judgmental creative, or is it allegorical? Okay, very good. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to put if there are any more questions, this is your last chance. I'm going to put Zach's question and Maritza's questions together. And then the two specific things about this Canto 22 and 28 and Ugolino will do at the end. And then we're going to, in the middle, we are going to do about violent depiction and the way in which Virgil guides Dante. So let's start.
Christiane had one as well.
Oh, Christiane, go ahead.
Yeah, it just popped into my head. So Nimrod is featured in the Dante story. And I was wondering, why was he turned into a giant for the story? Nimrod.
Nimrod. Okay, very
yeah.
good. So we'll put that along with the others. So these are kind of specific questions, 3 specific questions that we'll take at the end. Excellent. Let's see, modesty. Okay, let me go ahead. So first question is Zach's question. So now, folks, this is lightning round. So everybody is welcome to answer the questions. Okay, so just go ahead and type an exclamation mark if you'd like to answer the questions. So first question is that, how is Dante looking at this work? Is this a work of self-examination, or is this a work of just condemning bad people? David.
Yeah, I think it's mentioned even in Canto 26 that he has regrets after he's looking at people that he's associated with, and he sees himself embedded in the politics, and he's like feeling the weight of the sins of these people, seeing how horribly these results are judged. And I think that he's weighing on his own soul in this process. So I think this is about the trip. It means what it means to take this trip alive, to be able to get to see this. It's a very special thing, you know. So he's being granted a privilege, and it's telling him to elevate himself in some way, you know. And he's really going through all of these. Without this horror vision, I don't think the rest of what we're going to read, which I've never read, I don't think it would have the same impact. I'm not set up for all positive. I need to see a descent and a rise. So I think this is something you have to match up to a real life. So I see him narrating his own spiritual path in a certain way. So that makes it very allegorical, but very personal. And it can still reflect the spiritual structure to the world that he considers the built-in structure. Because he's willing to, because he's willing to weigh against the church, even giving a dispensation when the church is wrong. If they're doing it based on a lie, even that doesn't fly. This is a higher level of judgment.
Excellent. Thank you, David. Next up is going to be Vanessa, followed by Joe. Vanessa, what do you think? Is this a work of self-examination or a means of just condemnation?
Well, like I put in the thing, I almost saw it as propaganda. And maybe like, if you follow the teachings of the Catholic Church, if you go down the wrong path, this is what you may face in the Inferno. And it could also be the thing to see, okay, maybe I got to correct my path, so to speak, so I don't end up down here. So a little bit of both, possibly.
Thank you. Joe.
I think the fact that he's guided by a poet kind of tells you that it is a bit of self-examination, and that, the whole, and the idea that, he's using figures. He held positions of power himself, and he's using all those positions, people that are analogous to himself, or, that are similar to himself. So I think it has to be an examination of both himself and others, as well as, I think, even if it is subconsciously, he's doing it.
Okay, very good. Maritza.
So this came up in my breakout room. What I see happening here, though, is it's like shining a spotlight on the climate of the times, whereas, there still exists this oppressive church like edict. And how do we separate, or can we somehow not assume that is heavily influencing this work?
Mm-hmm. Got it. All right, let's just go to your question. Your question was, so Maritza's question was, is this is this just super judgmental creator doling out judgments, or is this more allegorical? How do you see this work? What the entire structure, entire realm of punishments, what exactly is going on? What is being displayed? Phil, you can answer both of them if you want.
Wait, there were two. I only heard one about the
No.
judgment.
The super judgment. Go ahead.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know, Maritza, if you were with us for the very first Inferno session, but in it, I think I mentioned about a letter that Dante wrote to Can Grande della Scala, who was essentially a patron of his, dedicating a portion of the Commedia to him. And in that letter, which is now famous, he explains the at least four ways that you can read this work. The first one being literal. So this is the one I think where most of us are kind of stuck by definition, because we have to process it initially with the imagery that he uses. So when we read about the accursed rain, we picture accursed rain. But that's just the first level. And that's a device. It's a literary device for us to the second level, which is the allegorical level, the metaphorical level. And Dante himself, in this letter to Can Grande, he says, okay, the second layer is the allegorical. What am I trying to portray when I say accursed rain? What am I trying to say when I depict all these different things? The third level is moral. What's the moral of the story? What's the whole point? But there's actually another one, which is the deeper one, which is what he calls anagogical, or the final. And that's he actually spells it out in generally. He doesn't spell it out specifically for each canto, but he spells it out generally for the entire work, which is this: to take a man from a state of sin or a state of self-destruction and transfer him to a state of flourishing. So ultimately, the work is about that. It's an ethical work about what he considers to be destructive tendencies in the world, personally and socially, and taking that from that to a state of flourishing. And progression actually makes sense when you think about Inferno as the negative part of that. In other words, what not to do. Purgatory is how to overcome it, and then Paradiso is the positive. How do you actually supposed to live? And we'll see that as we go along. So right now we're in the negative part of this, which is, okay, if you do this, if you touch a hot plate with your finger, you're going to get burned, like cause and effect. It's very Aristotelian in the sense that you have this sort of cause and effect. Okay, you're a glutton, well, you're going to be in this accursed rain. You're lustful, okay, you're going to be swayed all over the place by emotions. You're wrathful, well, okay, you're going to be boiling and experiencing this boiling thing, all your life, etc. Or if you sow discord, then you yourself will be kind of taken. So all of these things that really are appalling to us, if we take them literally and dwell on them literally, I think that's I can identify with that. I mean, I try not to think too much about somebody being split open and their guts hanging out, because if I did, I would probably be repelled as well. But the point of that is to say, whatever it is, whatever terrible picture you have in your mind, when you picture that, a person that's sowing division and dividing people, that's doing that terrible thing. So the reason for the graphic language is, like any good writer, you're trying to use hyperbole to reach your audience. Otherwise, if you just said, oh, we were actually talking about Tarantino, and people in my breakout room were wondering, Maritza, if you enjoy Tarantino, because Tarantino does exactly that. He takes violence to this absurd level to communicate some kind of, well, in his, I guess, to make an interesting movie, I guess. Excuse me. So anyway, that's all.
Phil, that's a great point. I want to emphasize that. I mean, these four levels are actually, if you look at the Middle Ages, these are the four ways in which all scriptures, all works were analyzed. Okay, and this is called the word for doing this four-step process is called exegesis. I'm not pronouncing it correctly, but that's what it is. So, for example, let me just go through it. So, first one is the literal level. where you're saying, okay, what does this actually mean? When he said this, what did he actually mean? So for example, when people study Bible, that's what they do. They say, okay, they use all these 4 levels. So what is literally said? Now that actually corresponds to these 4 Aristotelian causes. Okay, so let me come at that. So that's first one. The second one is allegorical, or it's basically what you're telling a story, you're telling a parable that has a meaning. So what does it mean it's showing in concrete, suggesting what the meaning is. So that's allegorical. The third one is moral. So what should I do? And the fourth one is, anagogical, which is about ending. If you went along this path, where will you end up? Okay, so if you want to map that into Aristotelian causes, the final cause is the anagogical. They'll say, okay, this is where you will end up if you did this. The efficient cause is the moral. That's what you actually do. Okay, the allegorical is the material cause. So in matter, in concretes, they're showing you a story. Okay, and the formal cause is the literal cause. Okay, the concept of literal cause is very high in Bible or in all of these works. They're weighing those words very carefully, and they're trying to say this. So this way of looking at text was a core part of what they did during medieval times, and that is derived from Aristotle by people like Aquinas and Dante, who took in Aristotle and applied those 4 causes. Now that way of thinking is actually quite foreign to today's time, because today's time people mostly focus on the efficient cause and the material cause. And that's what they're kind of most obsessed about. And the final cause they don't see. So what does this actually mean in the long term? Or the formal or the literal cause. So that's kind of a quick quick comment.
Yeah, that's great, actually, Shrikant. Thank you for pointing that out. I didn't connect the dots between the causes of Aristotelian causes and the 4 levels of exegesis, but that's actually very, very good. I think that's exactly right.
Thanks, Phil. Next up is David, Doug, and Zach. David.
Yeah, I think you guys have given a pretty encyclopedic, comprehensive answer to the question, because you quoted Virgil himself, and you have a lot of knowledge of that context. And what Shrikant brought up is also part of traditional, of course, study of the Bible in its own language, in its own context. The Jewish study of the Bible, the 4 levels of exegesis are called Pshat, Drash, Remes, and Sod. Pshat is the simple, the plain level. And as Shrikant said, because every letter is sacred, everything has to be weighed in. And if the same word is used somewhere else, this is another level of pursuit, the exposition of the text. So it's used there, it's used here. Do they mirror each other? Do they parallel? Do they reinforce? Or do they fight each other? So that's getting deeper into why the story is told the way it's told. That level is called drash. And then the final level is the moral that's being told. No, the third level is the moral that's being told. And the final level is what's the essence, the essential root. So it's very, very similar to what you're saying. And those 4 letters together spell out the word pardes, which sounds a little like paradise, and it's the name. It's supposed to be this garden where these 4 major rabbis went to discuss something and to learn, and like their minds are blown out, and only one walks out alive. Okay, because you have to be able to handle all of these kinds of contexts to take the truth out of something.
Excellent point, David. I just want to add one thing. There are 2 ways of looking at, of reading text. Exegesis is one. The opposite of that is eisegesis, where you're saying, how does it impact me? And almost all reading that everybody does today is that. They are not doing this systematic. The exegesis is actually a very rigorous way of looking at writing, which is saying that this writing is important. I want to draw out every bit of meaning from it. Today's culture is very subjectivist. They are focused on how does this make me feel? And people just say something based on what that is. And that is called Eisegesis. So that's the distinction between the two. Next up is going to be Doug, followed by Zach. Doug. Doug, you are on mute. Let's see what's happening with
My
Doug.
comment relates to the question about self-judgment, judging others, but it also relates to, is the God a judgmental creator, or is it more allegory? And I've kind of increasingly, as I read this time through, I'm jumping to the idea of the city, and what's a healthy city? What's a holy city? What's the city of God? What is the, and this goes back to the Greeks, Thebes represents one thing, and Athens represents a different kind of inclusivity, whereas Thebes is xenophobic and fearful of what's outside and more violent. And so this idea of what's a healthy city, and there's a book by a rabbi about Los Angeles called Justice in the City by Rabbi Aryeh Cohen. And it follows this idea into contemporary times. What makes a healthy city? And I think that's a different political issue, because civil war really comes out in a city. It's family against family and brother against brother, and divisions are right at home. And so this idea, which I don't really know the book, The City of God, but I'm curious. I think it's like in Greek tragedy, there's the hero and there's the chorus. And in a way, Dante is talking about both of those. He's really not supporting the Pope or the power figure or the leader. He's supporting a different kind of group consciousness of what's a healthy life. And so I think that's what a lot of this book is about, and the misuse of language creates an unhealthy city. Oddly, when I ran a theater for 20 years in San Diego, I often thought of myself, well, a theater maybe should reflect the soul of the city. Now, that's an odd sort of thing to try to do, but it was an interesting task, because San Diego really represents the cross-section of the US, hippies and military people and Republicans and Democrats, and it shifted from Republican to Democrat, and business people and dropouts. And you got mountains and you got beaches and you got the border and you got all these different things. So it was an interesting task to say, okay, a theater should reflect the soul of a city, like it did in Greece, or Shakespeare's theater for London. And I go back to the idea of a village or a city. Apparently, the Greeks felt that if somebody went to the center of the city and cried, "We're being invaded," or "fire," or rang a bell, and if you couldn't hear it at the edges of the city was too big. So I think that's an idea of, increasingly, we probably should think more of our neighborhoods than of even cities, because even cities exploit neighborhoods, and the problems are not solved. So I've spent a lot of time trying to get to know my own neighborhood in Los Angeles, and it's like a small town in the middle of a huge megalopolis. So,
no, that's a fantastic point, Doug. And I can see in my mind the theaters in Athens and various Greek cities, these giant theaters, open air theaters, which were actually the center, and which actually reflected the city. So wonderful. Next up is Zach. Zach, go ahead.
Well, maybe it's past, because I think Doug kind of brought into a new question. I was going to parrot some of the things said earlier.
Okay, sounds good. Let's see. Next up is going to be, we're going to look at questions, two questions now. First one, what do you think of the way in which Virgil is leading Dante? What is his role? Is it like leading a child? Is it being a mentor, an apprentice? What is the way in which you think Virgil is leading Dante? What are your observations about that? Go ahead and type exclamation mark if you would like to answer that question. All right.
Could you repeat the question?
The
Sorry.
question was, Virgil is leading Dante. What kind of leading is he doing? Is he leading him as a child? Is he leading it as a apprentice, as a mentor, as an equal? What is the relationship between Virgil and Dante as Virgil leads him? It's going to be Phil, Joe, and Michael. Phil.
Thank you for whoever asked that question. I think it's very, very apropos of covering the highlights of what we've read. So I think there's, it's really a deeper, there's a deeper truth hiding behind that question, which is what is the relationship between Dante, a Christian, and Virgil, a classicist, relationship between the classical and the Christian in this work. And I think bringing in another poet from a different era is a really ingenious way to answer that. So to answer the specific question, though, what do you think about how Virgil leads him? Well, he leads him sometimes very well and other times not so well. And I think that's the point, that the relationship with the classical to the Christian is, it's helpful sometimes, it's not helpful at other times, and many times it's powerless. And if we look at some of the ways in which Virgil has fared so far, we can remember, for instance, at the city of Dis, when he experienced his first setback, he couldn't get in. And it took a messenger from heaven, a Christian angel, to actually help them on their way. So Virgil kind of failed at that point. Then, if you remember, when we had that little skirmish with the demons, Virgil took their advice at face value, forgetting that they're in the fraud section of hell, and nobody can be believed in a fraud section of hell. And of course, they lied to him. They lied, and the reason they lied is because they were trying to trap them and get them. But Dante, even though he is a pupil, he is a follower, he's a disciple, had enough sense in him to realize that, and he suggested to Virgil, you know what, they are coming to get us. And if it wasn't for that suggestion, and Virgil thankfully took it to heart at that point, they were saved. At other times, yes, there's this sense that Dante is getting distracted. He is either, he is participating, he's listening, he's enjoying what someone called I guess a metaphor of social media, a brawl between two sinners. And Virgil steps in and says, no, this is not right. And he's correct. And so it's very interesting to see that interplay of give and take. They both in some ways complement each other, but there's a very clear sense also that Virgil's influence as they progress is getting smaller. And of course, we will part ways with Virgil at the end of Purgatorio, which will be a very emotional scene. I don't want to spoil it for you, but it's obvious that there's a limit to the classical tradition. And I think Dante's way of playing that out through a personal engagement with another poet, is very, very, very telling and very, very well executed.
Excellent. Next up is going to be Joe, Michael, Doug, Allison, and David. Joe.
So it's an interesting question, because if, and just reading it and trying to get a feel for it, I kind of feel like they're friends, and that there's an admiration for Virgil, that Dante has, and there's a trust there that exists in guiding him through this. So while, Virgil is, makes mistakes along the way, I think that Dante's, ultimately puts his trust in him. And I think that that's where that's the relationship that I see. Anyway, that's the feeling I get from the two of them and how they interact with one another. And it's also more, I do see it as a mentor as well, because he does explain to him why people are in hell for certain reasons. And those explanations are key for him into understanding hell altogether. So
thank you. So we're going to go with Michael, followed by Maxine. Michael.
Well, I think that one of the keys is to go back and see how Virgil got the job. Virgil was sent there to help Dante get through the mess that he finds himself in and wasn't apparently able to do for himself. So the choice of Virgil, as a number of people have pointed out, is apt because he is a poet. He is a poet that Dante greatly admires. So there's a level of trust, a bond at the very beginning, so that Dante will permit the mentoring. And as they go on, Virgil's role is initially to basically be a pathfinder and to be a protector, and a protector of Dante's physical well-being, as well as his mental attitude towards what he's doing. So there's some discipline that is imposed on him there by Virgil. As he goes on, there are moments when Virgil loosens the reins a little bit, and Dante has a little more freedom to maybe perhaps interact with the damned on his own. And as we get further and further, sometimes the roles reverse. As somebody pointed out that in the eighth circle there, they might not have gotten out if Virgil hadn't listened to Dante and they had taken the strategy that they did. But finally, it's going to be Virgil will reach the end of his role. That he will not be able to, he isn't suitable to go beyond a certain point. And I think this goes back and relates to just exactly how far can we take the classical experience as a guide to life. And we can take it to a certain extent, but just as it fails Virgil in Dante's eyes, at a certain point, it would fail Dante. And he would not get to the Paradiso. He would only get as far as Virgil can get. So, Virgil's role is very multi-layered.
Wonderful, beautifully put. Thank you, Michael. Next up is Maxine, Doug, Allison, and David. Maxine.
Virgil was there to give him moral support. And I would not be surprised if he wasn't his lover.
Okay, next up is going to be Doug, followed by Allison. Doug. Doug, you're on mute.
It's a great question. I think it shifts. I think he takes Virgil's a teacher to a student. At times he's like a father or a big brother to a child. He actually lifts him and carries him 2 or 3 times, which I'd forgotten from the first reading. And then he's a peer, poet, brother. That's the level where I think they're closest, as people have mentioned. They're allies at times where they have to coordinate to sort of protect themselves against the demons. And then sometimes Virgil's kind of a servant serving Dante as a master, because he has certain things that he wants to know, Dante, and Virgil serves what Dante needs. And at other times he treats him like a dog. If he had a choke chain, he'd jerk it and go, that's wrong. So I think it shifts like real people. It made me think of that Eric Byrne in Games People Play, and the shifting, how you treat somebody as your parent and then your child and then your peer and your brother. And the games Dante and Virgil play, I think, are interesting.
Wonderful. Thank you, Doug. That was great. Next up is Allison, followed by David. Allison.
Yeah, I think it's like a sibling relationship, with Virgil being the older sibling. And so usually the older sibling is leading the way, but then sometimes the younger sibling sort of takes over, and then it's batted back down again by the older sibling.
I thought that was it. I think that's a great way of putting it. because it actually captures all the other things that people are talking about, because that's, you know, that relationship, I think that captures it really well. Thank you. Next up is David.
There, okay. Looking to click. Okay, yeah, I agree with what everyone's saying, but I want to put it a slightly different angle on it, which is, so Virgil is Dante's writing Virgil. So what is Dante putting him in there? He's putting him in there as an expansion of his own consciousness, his own self. It's like a mirror of himself. If he were the greatest poet and had age and wisdom and all this reasoning, so he's a foil to Dante, the traveling, the bumbling, you know, Florentian, you know, coming through. So they can play any game in relation to each other. Either can in a moment be helping the other or superior to the other, more knowledgeable, lingering. So the interplay of them is to expose the values that are supposed to be the right values as they go through. Sometimes you're supposed to indulge in reprimanding, or sometimes you're supposed to indulge in a feeling of sympathy. And so Virgil is letting that reflect because they share this common soul of being poets. So that's their similarity, is they're mirrors of each other, but they can be in any playing relationship as a foil to this, tell that story. But the limit, as you pointed out, which I you know, is only hinted at for me because I haven't read the other two parts of the commedia, is the limits of reason have to end at some point. We have to get beyond that because we know that doesn't take you to Beatrice. Beatrice.
Next up is Madeline.
Yes, I still think, as I'd said in an earlier discussion, that an important part of Virgil's place in the narrative is that he legitimizes Dante as a poet. Dante's guide, it's like the tradition of shamanism, where a shaman will start out by reciting who their shamanic lineage is, or someone in academia, what scholars they studied with and who that person studied with, and back and back and back to Linnaeus or whoever. I think that Dante chose Virgil very carefully to legitimize himself in the classical tradition, and also to align himself with someone who at the time was viewed as being of sort of immortal value in terms of his writing.
Wonderful, wonderful point. Next up is Zach.
Yeah, I was just gonna share something that Joe had said, which I thought was great. He made this great connection, which is that Virgil is Dante's ideal, and I think that there's symbolism there in that, like, your ideal a lot of times is your guide. That is the thing that is guiding you forward, and that thing that kind of gives you direction. So I love that. I hadn't thought of that. So shout out to Joe for the smarts.
Excellent, excellent. Next question is Joe's question. What's with all this violent depictions? Why are the depictions so violent? Go ahead and type exclamation. Zach.
So one maybe superficial level understanding. I've been like learning a lot about memory and, you know, kind of what sticks in our memory. And one of the things all of these like memory experts will tell you is bizarre images stick out, violent images stick out, sexual images stick out, funny images stick out. So, I mean, at least at that level, it makes sense that these are super violent because, like, damn it, we remember them. Like, you know, there's a reason that, you know, we don't tend to remember subtlety very well. And that's why, like, this kind of polemical style really just like stays with us. And probably, you know, I'm sure a few years from now, like, I'll still be able to remember what happens to the, you know, the blasphemers or whichever level.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is going to be Madeline, Joe, and Vanessa. Madeline.
Yes, I think that it's so violent physically because there really is no other way to describe it. To have that level of revenge, to discuss it in terms of, I mean, really, he wants revenge on their souls. He wants them to suffer internally. But the only way he can convey that to us is through the thing that we have in common when we read or talk, which is our bodies. And so that's why it's so violent and gruesome and bizarre and like some really weird horror film.
Thank you. Next up is Joe, followed by Vanessa. Joe.
Yeah, it was just something that I would just want to maybe articulate a little bit better when clarifying, and Zach and actually Madeline had captured it beautifully for as far as an answer is concerned. But you know, one of the things that I did is try to sit down and figure out what Dante was thinking when he was writing this, and I can figure out the levels of hell, and I can even come to some similar conclusions. But if I were to write, as you know, Phil was saying earlier about putting, you know, who would be there today, I don't know if I could come up with that type of gruesome, that it's almost so, there's a level of hatred there, or you're disturbed at a certain point that you're coming up with such specific ways of torturing another individual. It seems somewhat disturbing. That's all, to be able to come up with that. And I that's the part I couldn't. I was like, okay, if I had Scarelli and put him in a certain level of hell, I don't know if I would, you know, well, maybe actually I would have him wear a lead jacket. But I mean, it's still. But there are things of how even schisms are sown, and you know, having people cut up. That's the reason why I just wanted to explain that a little bit more in detail. How did it even arrive at that? But I think Zach and Madeline answered it nicely.
Yeah, excellent. Because this is allegorical. Just like you have to give a perceptual concrete that makes people remember what the point you're trying to do. If you try to do it in a very subtle way, people will not remember it. People will not even notice it. So that's kind of the extremity is necessary for people to say, look, I mean, what the artist is doing is that he's concretizing what the issue is. This is really important. Pay attention. Don't do that. You know?
And after 700 years, we're still here. So we're
right, exactly. It's working pretty well. Next up is going to be Vanessa, David, Doug, and Phil. Vanessa. Why is the imaginary so violent?
Well, my initial answer is simple and childish terms to scare the bejesus out of us. And I also think a more explanation, you think of a parent, you know, maybe telling the child, if you eat such and such, you're going to have, you know, stuff thrown out of your stomach, just to kind of deter the child from doing a certain action. And also it kind of shows that there's repercussions, and it kind of fits the crime. Like if you, that one, I have to read it again, but how it said, if in 100 years he would not have moved an inch and stuff like that. So I mean, it's like, whoa, let me maybe reconsider and pause before I act.
Thank you. Next up is going to be David, Doug, and Phil. David.
Right. I see a problem for Dante in how to describe sin and problematic behavior in the world. And the solution he's taking is eye for an eye, that he has to find a way to express justice as a balance so that the scale is flat. And he's going to explain what flat would be to him in terms of the damage done to a soul, done to a body, done to community, family, done to confronting God, you know, the wrong approach. It's like, how would you portray that? By having a sentence passed and a decree made? That just wouldn't carry, that's not justice. Justice is, there's a balance somewhere and it has to level out. So he's portraying the physical meaning of what that might be if you thought about reality. The reality of the sin has to be matched in some way. And he's trying to do it artistically.
Thank you. Doug.
I think the punishments in hell are so violent because the punishments for crimes and sins were extremely violent and very public. And also the source, this may be the answer to the question about the comedy in the piece, is those kind of public punishments were also a source of great glee and humor. And I mean, that's unfortunate to say that, but that's one reason why I think public punishments have disappeared, is because people got so much fun out of them, shaming somebody or whatever. So I think he was reflecting the punishments of the day.
Thank you. Phil.
Doug, you stole my thunder.
I could almost feel myself doing that. I could.
Yeah. No, that's great. I mean, it's great that we both thought of the same thing. I think it kind of validates it. I just want to add one thing. If you've read Michel Foucault, Discipline and Punish, he talks about this evolution of going from extremely public, extremely violent punishment to a situation where you have a surveillance state that is so able to almost prevent crime, but at the expense of constant psychological pressure. His point in that is he's not sure, actually, as maybe you are, that we live in a better situation. He was arguing that the reason primarily people were drawn and quartered or burnt alive or things like that is because the state realized that it was better to do that to one person and create this impression on everyone else than to have to execute hundreds of thousands of people or maybe put them in jail for years. And we don't think about that, but we have an enormous amount of people spending time in jail, just completely mind-boggling. And in medieval times, they did not have budgets for people staying in jail for 20 years. I mean, it just was not, you either were punished, mostly executed, or you just lived, you learned the lesson from the other person. And so we are, again, this is going back to the medieval mindset. You have to remember, we're not the same culture that they were in. And what's cruel to us was every day to them. So Dante, living in that context, had to go one step further to create that literary impression on the people that he was trying to communicate with. So I think that's why it's so violent, but it wasn't that violent to them. It was probably, like Doug said, it's par for the course.
Excellent point. Next up is going to be Allison, Michael, and Madeline. Allison.
Yeah, I was thinking, I wonder what people in Saudi Arabia would think of this, because we're so shocked by the violence, because, you go to jail, but it's like tucked away. You're not watching them in jail. You're not watching them suffer. We have the death penalty, but you don't see it happen. They're not hanging the person in the town square. But, in a country where, there's certain countries, I mean, Singapore, Saudi Arabia, where it's much more eye for an eye. I wonder if people living there would look at this with the same shock that we feel.
Next up is going to be Michael, Madeline, and Maxine. Michael.
I just wanted to mention that the violence that we see and the animosity that Dante exhibits, part of that, I believe, is that the situation, we talk Guelph, Ghibelline, okay, it's two factions. This was gang warfare in all of northern Italy. I mean, it had totally upended the society, and so that the people who were involved, at least Dante felt, were involved in inciting these things on either side, were really responsible for a great deal of death, destruction, dislocation, very ugly things, and so. It wasn't like, oh, I don't like the way this guy talked to me in the council chambers. That's not what this is about. It's certainly in most cases, and so I think it's useful to remember just exactly what the environment was like, because this was just nonstop, unchecked gang warfare that was going on for a very long period of time, aided and abetted by both the religious and temporal rulers of the time. And so, yeah, there's a lot of motivation there.
Thank you. Next up is Madeline, followed by Maxine. Madeline.
Yes, I was thinking about the discussion of violence and how much people enjoy public executions. And I think that part of the reason that Western civilization has moved away from that was the development of Puritanism. There was a sport common in Europe, a public entertainment called bear baiting, where you would have a chained bear and basically torture it while it roared and starved to death. They also did it with captive badgers. They would have horrendous dog fights like that. The Puritans vehemently objected to all of this, not on the basis of animal cruelty. No, they objected because people enjoyed it. It was a cultural enjoyment, and they were trying to eliminate things that people enjoyed in the world.
Thank you, Madeline. Next up is Maxine. Maxine.
Have you looked at any of the TV shows lately and the movies? They are worse. They are more violent than ever. There isn't any of them without violence. Now, try and find one. Maybe they should take this Dante story and replace Game of Thrones, which is a very big hit, and we would all enjoy it. But I think that Dante, if he could see into the future, he would have been a screenwriter.
Certainly, he was one of the most successful screenwriters. He just produced everything, and we're still talking about him for 700 years. I'm sure he would be able to adapt to this medium very, very effectively. All right, so now we're going to go for 3 last questions, which are very specific questions. So I'm going to put all 3 of them on the table. If anybody has anything to say about any of these 3, you can go ahead and type exclamation mark. The first one is about Nimrod. The second one was about Ugolino. And the third one was the discrepancy between Canto 22 and 28. So if anybody wants to say anything about the nature of Nimrod, the story of Ugolino, or the discrepancy, go ahead and type exclamation mark. And after this, we're going to wrap up. All right, anybody? Okay, it doesn't look like. So let's not go into, let's do one thing. Let's give a preview. Phil, what are we doing next time?
So we're doing the first, I believe, 10 canto, or 10 or 11, I'll double check, cantos in Purgatorio. So we're out of hell finally. Congratulations, everyone.
Maxine, you made it with a good guide.
Yes, things should be picking up. For those of you who are tired of punishments, things should be picking up. However, not entirely yet out of the woods. So
for that, you'll have to wait till Paradise, right?
Yeah, we'll have to wait till Paradise till we're all rosy and comfortable.
Well, I certainly hope that all of you make it to Paradise.
So think of it this way. We're out of the prison cell, but we're still in the dentist's office, the old dentist's office without the Novocaine.
All right, wonderful. All right, so thank you very much, Phil. Thanks, Doug, and thanks everybody. This was just wonderful. I really liked all the comments and questions. I thought it worked out really well. Thank you, folks. See you folks soon.
Thank you.
Bye.